From National Review headquarters in New York City, this is a Capital Writing author interview. Our guest today is Matt Lewis. He is a senior columnist at the Daily Beast, and he is the author of the book "Filthy Rich Politicians." Thank you for being here, Matt.
Hey, good to be here.
All right, so the book's called "Filthy Rich Politicians." This probably isn't something that people naturally affiliate with politicians, right? Being filthy rich. It's usually something we think about with CEOs or actors or entertainers or people like that. But a lot of politicians actually end up making a lot of money.
Yeah, I think it's really two parts. First, rich people tend to get elected, so it's self-selecting. And then once people get elected, they tend to get richer. I think that's the more troubling part of this, to the degree that it's troubling. But yeah, I don't know that. I would say it's a more recent phenomenon whereby this is becoming problematic, and where I think it's beginning to erode trust in uh, our elected officials and our institutions, and partly because of the sense that they are using their perch to feather their nests.
Uh-huh. And when you say feather their nest, that includes the other members of their family too, a lot of times, right?
Absolutely. I have a whole chapter in there about spreading the wealth around. And it kind of works both ways. There are a lot of politicians who made their money or who got rich by virtue of marriage. And then there are a lot of politicians who, once they get elected, not only do they themselves get rich, but their entire families essentially get on the payroll. Um, in the case of Joe Biden, for example, going back to his presidential campaign in 1988, The Atlantic reported he raised about $11 million for that presidential race, and about 20% of it went to the Biden family or companies that they worked for. And so, again, it's not just the politicians, but it is their friends and family who oftentimes reap the benefits as well.
So when you look at the salary for a House member, it's $174,000 a year. When you look at the salary for the president, it's $400,000 a year. And obviously, that's a lot of money compared to the median household income in the United States. And of course, these are people that we're asking to do really serious work, and so it makes sense that it would be a relatively high paid job. But that doesn't explain how these people become millionaires, and it doesn't explain how they, in some cases, become multimillionaires. So what is it that's going on that allows them to get so much more money than the salaries that they receive?
Yeah, I mean, so Nancy Pelosi, for example, makes $200,000 a year, give or take, and a salary. She would have to work 500 years at that salary to have her net wealth, her current net wealth. And that money primarily comes through stock trading by her husband, Paul Pelosi. I think that's very common for members of Congress, that their wealth is certainly not by virtue of their salary, but by virtue of investments. In the case of the Pelosi's, some of these investments look very suspicious, very sketchy, look very much like insider trading. But I think we've gotten now to a point where it's becoming more problematic. We've always had rich politicians. George Washington was incredibly rich. Theodore Roosevelt. Presidents especially have been, by and large, much richer than the rest of us. We are now at a point, though, where members of the House of Representatives, like the lower chamber, that's supposed to be the closest to we the people, are something like 12 times richer than the average American household. And I think it was in 2014 when the average member of Congress became a millionaire. And during that time, the gap has widened. In the last 3 or 4 decades, the gap has widened between how rich the politicians are and how rich we the people are. I mean, I'm not into class warfare, but I do think at a certain point it becomes an issue, and people begin to feel like the game is rigged. I think that sense has been helped along by some demagogic politicians, but nevertheless, there is reason to believe that that the game is rigged.
Yeah, you say you're not a fan of class warfare, and I'm not either. And but the point you're making in the book is basically that if we want to remain a society where we don't engage in class warfare, where that's a good thing, we should kind of stop giving reasons to believe in class warfare, right? And these things that you point out about people, members of Congress being so much wealthier than the average American, kind of does give some reason behind that, uh, and and it doesn't have to be a demagogic argument against it, right? You can make a principled case, and I think that's what you're trying to do in the book.
Definitely, and I propose reforms that I think would certainly not fix the problem, because I just don't believe in the perfectibility of anything, pretty much. But I do believe that we can have reforms that will mitigate problems. And so there are many in my book. I've got probably 15 proposals and reforms that, at some degree or another, would help to mitigate these problems. But banning stock trading for members of Congress, I think, is the most obvious thing we could do, because there really is a sense, and this is a bipartisan problem, but there really is a sense that members of Congress are using insider information to not only to get rich, but to avoid losses that other normal people might suffer, by using information that only they have access to. And I do think that's especially corrosive, when you're out there working a hard job and you're seeing these politicians, these fat cats, getting rich. And by the way, then of course they pay a lower tax rate than you would make off of your salary. So I think that's contributing. I don't think this is the cause of our populist zeitgeist, but I do think it's a contributing factor.
So, insider trading is already illegal. You're not allowed to do that. No one's allowed to do that. Why is that not sufficient to stop the appearance of insider trading by a lot of Congress people? Why don't we just step up enforcement of the law that we already have instead of making a new prohibition?
Well, first, the interesting thing is it wasn't even illegal till 2012 for members of Congress when they passed the Stock Act. So it's a fairly recent thing that it's illegal for members of Congress to trade on inside information. But I think it's very clearly the Stock Act has not been sufficient. And if we just look at recent examples, like in the past decade since the Stock Act passed, and I'll give you, let's go bipartisan, right? So first, in the aforementioned case of Nancy Pelosi, I'll just give you a couple of very curious trades that Paul Pelosi made just in the past few years. I believe it was in 2020 when he exercised options, hundreds of thousands of dollars of stock options to buy Tesla stock. Within 5 weeks, President Joe Biden announced that there would be a mandating that federal, state, and local fleets begin to transition to zero emissions vehicles. You can imagine what happened to the price of Paul Pelosi's Tesla stock once that announcement was made, again, just 5 weeks after he made that bet. Then in 2021, Paul Pelosi exercised stock options for, I think it was $10 million worth of Microsoft stock. This time it was just 2 weeks later that the U.S. Army announced a deal with Microsoft to purchase these basically augmented reality headsets that could be worth billions of dollars. So again, pretty lucky bet for Paul Pelosi. But again, it's bipartisan, and we saw with COVID, Senator Richard Burr being the most prominent example, I think, of a politician who engaged in very curious behavior. So remember, this is at a time when the average American knew COVID existed, but was not aware how serious it would be. Certainly that we were not aware that there would be shutdowns to the degree, and how it would affect the economy. And so Richard Burr at the time was chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's privy to all sorts of classified briefings and documents and all that. And again, well before most of us knew how bad it was, he dumped hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of stock in things like Wyndham Hotels, right? The kinds of things that might not fare well in a global pandemic. Then he picks up the phone and calls his brother-in-law. Within 1 minute of hanging up the phone with Richard Burr, his brother-in-law calls his broker and dumps his stock. So None of these people got into trouble. I think there was an investigation into Burr. He stepped down as chair of the Intel committee. I believe the FBI even seized his cell phone, but he's perfectly fine. They couldn't find anything. And part of the problem is that it's really hard to prove insider trading, because the truth is that, for example, when Richard Burr dumped his stock, there were reports, certainly in Asia and in foreign newspapers, that that COVID was going to be really bad, and so you can always point to some report. But my point is, it doesn't matter whether Nancy Pelosi or Richard Burr actually engaged in insider trading. The fact is that it looks like they did. That creates the appearance of impropriety. That erodes trust in our elected officials and in the system. And based on that alone, I think that we should ban stock trading for members of Congress.
Yeah, it was like when Hillary Clinton became a genius cattle futures trader overnight, and it was just because she read the Wall Street Journal, right? So,
Right.
it can happen. But no, I had a somewhat different reform, I think, for the stock issue. What I would like to see is we keep it legal, but we have real time disclosure. So you complete transparency. Every move is made. And then we create a mutual fund that just does whatever the members of Congress do, so that all of us can get in on these amazing returns above the market. I think that would be great. But no, yeah, it definitely does create problems. And then, but no, I mean, if we made such a mutual fund, I think you say in the book there's a study that finds that members of the House outperform the market by like 6% or something like that.
Yeah, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. The interesting thing is that I think the real benefit, to be honest, is not outperforming the market. It's in times of crisis or big change, they do not lose their shirts. That's the key. It's not really making money off of insider trading, although that certainly happens. Certainly happens. But it is mitigating the downside of a loss during something like a financial crisis, or even something like Obamacare passing, or COVID, or the invasion, Russia's invasion into Crimea. Getting out. It's not just buying certain stocks. It's what stock you dump that you do not lose your shirt. I think that's an even bigger part of the equation.
So going back to the issue of family members, when a politician wants to make their family members rich, obviously it's not as simple as just handing them money, or just what are the things that a politician sets up in order to allow their family members to make money off of their influence and position?
Right. So sometimes this money is coming from businesses or donors who want to please the politician. Right. So let's think Hunter Biden getting a job, I don't know how much money from Burisma for his expertise in the energy industry. That presumably that is something that is to make Joe Biden happy, or to lobby Joe Biden. Other times it's the politicians themselves paying, or either paying out of the campaign or directing money that they have access. Sometimes taxpayer money, sometimes campaign money. So there's all sorts of examples. In the campaign world, Ron Paul employed something like 6 of his family members in his presidential race. In the sort of consulting world, Ilhan Omar, I believe, paid something like $1 million, directed something like $1 million worth of campaign funds to her husband's consulting firm. AOC, not nearly as egregious, but has paid, I guess it's her boyfriend, some campaign money, or directed campaign money his way. Maxine Waters has paid her daughter, I think it was $80,000 in 1 year, for example. I think it was 2021. So various ways that this happens. But again, it is enriching the family members of politicians and spreading the wealth around. And this is pervasive. Like, this is not just a handful. This is probably the majority of members of Congress at some level are finding ways to help their family members get rich as well.
One of the problems that you talk about in the book is obviously as this relates to marriages. And one of the problems with that in terms of reform is that, there is going to be a certain amount of intermarriage within the class of high level politicians, just like there's an intermarriage within every different industry that exists everywhere else in the country. So what are and obviously, your spouse is going to support you in your campaign, or at least you certainly hope they would. So what kind of reforms are possible there to make that seem less fishy, while also understanding that there is going to be a certain amount of mixing that's just inevitable in that kind of circumstance.
I think maybe the most prominent example of this was Roy Blunt, former senator from Missouri, who I think 3 or 4 of his children are lobbyists. His wife was a lobbyist. I think she was a tobacco lobbyist. And then he retired and went to work at a lobbying firm. So, it's just, and by the way, they tried to use it against him at his last campaign. Nobody cared. Didn't work. Look, I mean, obviously, I think that you have to really go out of your way to avoid even the appearance of impropriety, and to try your best to avoid conflicts of interest. Having said that, Roy Blunt's wife was a professional lobbyist when they married. Is she supposed to quit? Is he supposed to quit being a senator? One of Blunt's sons was the governor of Missouri, who before becoming a lobbyist, should he have, can't he be a lobbyist? He was the governor. So you start to look at it and it gets complicated and messy. Some of the reforms by the way, again, I have no illusion that we can fix these problems. Just like you can't, murder is already illegal, but we can't stop murders from happening. I think policies can impact the crime rate and can lower the murder rate and can disincentivize things. And I think the same thing is true in our politics when it comes to corruption, that we can have policies and incentives that make it worse or make it better. And so that's kind of what I'm advocating. So one of the things I would do would be outlaw hiring immediate family, to either work on your campaign or to work in your congressional office. They could do it for free if they want to. If you want to volunteer on a campaign, by all means do it. But that would avoid being able to kind of launder money into family members. That's, by the way, not your money. It's taxpayer money, or it's campaign donor money. It's not really yours to spread around. Another thing I would do that's somewhat related, in the sense that it has to do with lobbying, is have a 10-year moratorium on going into lobbying. This is actually less to do with the family, but since I mentioned lobbying, I'll throw that in there. Right now, I believe it's in the House, there's a 1-year cooling off period. And in the Senate, I believe it's 2 years you have to wait before taking that revolving door. Some people like Ted Cruz and AOC actually want a lifetime ban. One of the things I propose is a 10-year ban.
While we're on the topic of lobbying, you talk about the revolving door in the book, this idea that politicians, either go from lobbying government to being in government, and then after they're in government, they go back to lobbying government. There's sort of an inevitable, there's partly inevitable problems here as well, because of course the people who best know the government are probably the people who were just in it. And so, there's every reason for lobbying firms and for corporations to want that kind of expertise when they're going back and doing that. But on the other hand, it obviously creates tons of conflicts of interest and these weird situations where, family relations and things like that are playing a major role. And so, can you talk a little bit more about the revolving door, how that works in practice? And, is that a problem that's getting worse, or is that a problem that's kind of just, steady as a problem, or what do you see as the future for that?
I think it's probably holding steady. It's been bad for a long time now, and I do think that the danger is someone who goes to Congress, does favors for industries, certain lobbies, and then immediately upon leaving office, parlays, sort of taps into those favors that they've earned from carrying water, gets a high paying job, and is able to then kind of leverage their resources, leverage their connections and their Rolodex on behalf of their new clients. And so, again, I think part of the problem with this is that what it does to average Americans who are watching this play out. It's we hear about draining the swamp, like, well, this is kind of what draining the swamp is. The problem is that it's really hard to, at some level, lobbying is political participation. It's you know, I believe in something, and I want to advocate that Congress pass something or block something because I believe
We
in it.
have a right. We have a right to
Yeah,
petition the government for redress of grievances, right?
you put it better than me. And so it's what the danger is that you're sort of stifling political participation. I'm of the opinion that if nobody's telling you have to become a member of Congress and that you have to serve in that capacity, but I think that it is a responsibility. And so I'm not too concerned about asking more of them, and that includes a whole bunch of things like you can trade stocks all you want, but if you're going to be a member of Congress, you probably shouldn't be doing it, and your immediate family probably shouldn't be doing it. And if you want to serve in Congress, probably shouldn't plan on cashing in immediately going into lobbying, because I think that feeds this impression that the game is rigged and that it's very incestuous, and that these are a bunch of swampy fat cats. And you end up having a whole bunch of people who really just go from basically getting rich off of being a politician to getting rich off of being a lobbyist.
Mm-hmm. You talk a little bit about the founder's vision for public service and how there's a difference between that and what we think of today. The idea at that time was not career politicians. The idea was, this is a thing you do for a while. And then once your time is done, either because the voters send you home or because you've just been there for too long, you go back to your farm and you retire, and everything's nice. Nowadays, of course, we have these people who serve for a very long time, and they do that. In the process of doing that, become wealthy through politics, not through doing something else that would be more productive, let's say. What do you think it takes to get that idea of public service back? Because that's really not that's not something you can just sign a law and get people to think differently about. It's really a culture problem to a certain extent, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I think that part of it is the whole career politician thing. I mean, you're right. People used to come to Washington and then go back to the farm. Now they'd rather buy the farm than go back to it. And we have people like Joe Biden is a classic example, I think, of someone who's been in the Senate, I think, probably longer than I've been alive, or very close to as long as I've been alive, and is still and is not ready to give it up. And Dianne Feinstein is another example of someone who's in a very similar category. They do not want to leave for a variety of reasons. In some cases, they may feel like we really need them, and to be honest, maybe we do in some cases. But I also think that there's a feeling that that this is all they have. It's like an ego trip or something. They don't want to give it up. And I do think that the longer you're there and sort of the richer you get, you will become out of touch with the average American. And I think that a lot of Americans perceive that they are out of touch with their elected officials, and I think that is corrosive. to liberal democracy. I have just in the past few years become for the first time, a supporter of term limits. And I used to be opposed to term limits for a whole bunch of reasons, including the notion that, well, we have term limits. They're called elections, and if we get rid of the politicians, then we'll have these bureaucrats and staffers who are sort of the permanent entrenched bureaucracy. I've come to change my mind on that, and I think partly because I think that the system has been rigged to the extent that elections are really not holding politicians accountable in so many cases. They're in like gerrymandered districts. Their only competition is in a primary, and again, I think just look around at the gerontocracy we have. It's a plutocracy and a gerontocracy. So I think that term limits would address a lot of the problems in this book.
So it creates these problems with accountability. It creates problems with transparency with the voters and things like that. And yet, you point out in the book, we keep voting for these people, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of times that campaigns will try to make an issue of it, and they'll try to say, so and so is making their family member wealthy, or so and so did this stock trade that looks very suspicious, and voters most of the time they just kind of shrug at it. Why does it not seem to transfer in, even in competitive races where it seems like this should be a bigger issue?
Yeah, no, I looked at a whole bunch of examples. John Hoeven, senator from North Dakota, was attacked for doubling his wealth in the time he's been in the U.S. Senate, the last decade. I think he went from like $20 million to $40 million or something net worth. There's Daniel Goldman, the heir to the Levi fortune, who was attacked in a primary kind of for trying to buy the election. Doesn't work, by the way. Almost never works. Like being rich, even though we're in this populist era, a lot of the populists are super rich, and being rich doesn't seem, well, certainly the downsides of being rich from a PR standpoint do not outweigh the benefits of being rich in terms of what that may allow you to do, the freedom that may give you, and the ability to tap those resources to get your message out. At the same time, there is plenty of data in this book that suggests that the filthy rich politician, the impression that politicians, that the rich get elected and the elected get rich, is actually eroding trust in our elected officials in our democracy. And so my hypothesis is that at the micro level, when you're talking about voting for someone for Congress, it doesn't matter. You are going to vote based on something like ideology. Like, yeah, this guy's rich, but the other person likes Trump. Or, yeah, this guy's rich, but the other person's a leftist. And so it doesn't trump the other issues. So I think at the micro level, or at the individual level, it doesn't work to kind of demagogue the issue and talk about how rich or how out of touch someone is. Like, that rarely works. Having said that, I think at the macro level, there's a general sense that the game is rigged, that they're swamp creatures, that they're using their perch to get rich. And I think that this is having almost like a low grade corrosive effect on how people view elected officials in general.
When did people have a more positive view of elected officials, you think? I mean, I feel like the general position most people have on politicians always is that they lie a lot, that they're not very honest, that they're fake, they're phony. So what is it about this issue in particular you think that makes that worse?
So I think if you go back to let's say the 1960s, for example, ever since the 1960s, Americans have been losing trust in all sorts of institutions, right? So it's things like Vietnam, things like Watergate later in the 1970s. began to erode trust in institutions, and that includes, the media, the military, political leaders. Um, and so it's really hard to disentangle this trend from the global trend of Americans losing trust, faith in government and institutions. Having said that, um, part of the problem is that even though it's hard to disentangle the things, 30 or 40 years ago, members of Congress were much closer to the gap was not nearly as wide in terms of the wealth disparity or the income inequality, to use a term of art of late. It used to be that there were members of Congress who were plumbers and pipe fitters, and who were much more kind of from a blue collar background. And a lot of people, a lot more veterans too, for example. And so, looking at the data now, and by the way, there are like Pew Research polls that show that politicians and elected a politician has a negative connotation. I think they use the term elected officials, but elected officials are like the least popular of all of the different categories that they rank. Like less popular than teachers unions, less popular than big business. And so even though I think it's fair to say all of our institutions have been losing trust in the last 40 years, I think elected officials have been disproportionately hit. And it's fair to say that this correlates with the widening gap in terms of the wealth disparity.
Do you think reforms such as expanding the House of Representatives would help this problem? Because the theory behind that would be if you have more House members, the districts would be smaller. If the districts are smaller, it's not as expensive to run a campaign, and so people wouldn't have to be independently wealthy in order to run. Because that's one of the points you make in the book too, is that these days a lot of times you sort of have to have some independent wealth in order to run for certainly for federal office. And so, do you think something like that, where you kind of split it up, break it up more, would be able to make it so you didn't have to be so rich?
Absolutely. We're talking about spouses. So my wife is a Republican political fundraiser. And while I was writing this book, she and I went for a walk, and I was talking about how, I live in West Virginia, and I was saying if the political environment were different, there's all these open races right now in West Virginia. Maybe I could, run for Congress if things had gone differently. And she's like, oh, no, you couldn't. And I'm like, well, why not? I've been working in politics journalism for 15 or 20 years, or, I've got a network. I know people, and you're a political fundraiser. I mean, why couldn't I? And she's like, oh, no, if when someone comes and approaches me and says they want to run for office, what I tell them is I can't really help them unless they can first either self-fund $300,000 or have their personal Christmas card list give them $300,000. If they could do that, this is a House race, not a Senate race is higher, but for a House race, if they could do that, then I could take them and introduce them to PACs and conservative donors. But first, they have to be able to show that they can do that much. And I'm like, well, I guess I could never even I can't get elected. A guy who goes on TV and talks about politics is married to a political funder. I can't even get elected in West Virginia. You have to be rich. People don't even know. I mean, some of these folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, people think she's just a regular. She's worth like at least $5 million. I mean, like the populist, blue collar folks are multimillionaires. That's the price of entry for most races in this era. But to answer your question, I'm a huge advocate of uncapping the House. I think there should be a lot, like 5 times as many members of the House of Representatives. And I think it would solve a lot of our problems, including it would help address the problems in my book. I really thought long and hard about putting it in. It's not in my book.
Yeah.
And I thought, and I probably, in hindsight, I probably should have put it in. I didn't. The reason I didn't put it in is that I think it takes a little while to. It would take a little while to explain why doing this would affect the filthy rich politician phenomenon, because it's not obvious necessarily. But I think that would be one of the most important reforms we could make.
Yeah, initially it's like, oh no, there'd be more of them. But
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. um, uh, you talk about related to this independent wealth. You talk about the trend of loaning money to your campaign from yourself. This is a really weird idea at first because it sounds like you're lending money to yourself, and then as you explain it more, you realize you're essentially paying interest to yourself. How does that work?
Right. So basically, what happens is, generally speaking, when even if you're self, even if you're a self funder, even if you're loaded, you could be a billionaire or something. Generally speaking, you rarely give money to your campaign if you're running. What you would do is loan the money to the campaign, because then if you wanted to, you could retire that debt. So the theory would be, if you win, then you can do what's called debt retirement. You could raise money, and once you win, all of a sudden everybody wants to give you money, right? Because you're going to be voting on their issue. So now all the PACs, the defense contractors, all of a sudden, because you're going to be put on their committee, now they want to give you. So once you win, then you could retire that debt and pay yourself back. But what's interesting is that you could pay yourself back with interest. And there was a congresswoman, she's still in, her name escapes me right now, from California, who made around $200,000 from doing this. Now, I don't think she did it to get rich. I don't think she did it to make the $200,000, but she did. Over the course of several years, she profited like $200,000, and now, because of an FEC, I guess, Ted Cruz. So for a long time, you could only loan. There was a cap on how much money you could loan yourself. But Ted Cruz, I guess, sued the FEC under the guise that that was a freedom of speech violation. Money is speech, and there shouldn't be a limit. And so now you could loan your campaign indefinite amounts of money. So theoretically, and I'm happy to say that this has not been exploited. Like, this is not something that anyone has decided to exploit yet. But theoretically, someone who had a lot of money could make a lot more money by loaning their campaign money, and then doing debt retirement and paying themselves interest later. Has not been a big deal yet, but it's an example of how the rich get richer. And I think it will, at some point, someone will go even more than the $200,000.
Yeah, and just so people understand the mechanics of this, it's saying you as an individual, you are the candidate, you're independently
Yep.
wealthy, and you have your campaign, which is legally a separate organization from yourself. And so what you do is you loan money to the campaign, like you'd loan money to anybody else if you wanted to. And let's say, you could loan them $1,000,000, and then with 10% interest,
Or 18%.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it could be even higher. And again, though, it is a gamble, because if you lose, your chances of retiring debt are not good.
Yeah, that's
But
what I was going to get
if
into.
you
So you're
win,
betting on yourself winning, right? You're
yes,
betting on yourself winning, and then if you don't win, you could end up in real trouble, because then you're out that money. No one wants to donate to you once you lose, and then and now you could be begging people to give you money so that you can just pay back your debts.
yeah, even if you lose, you theoretically could do debt retirement, but no one's going to want to give you money if you lost. Isn't that interesting how that works?
Yeah, exactly. Um, what do you think about the sort of partisanship aspect of this, right? We definitely see this happening on both sides. It doesn't seem to be more common for Democrats than for Republicans, or for Republicans than for Democrats. Uh, is is there is there a corruption going on like within the party organizations, or is this just a case of it doesn't matter what organization you're part of, it doesn't matter, you could be an independent, we could have two totally new political parties tomorrow, it's just this fact of when people get sent to Washington D.C., all of the power, all the influence that goes on there, that this kind of stuff happens, or is it something that if we had different party institutions it would make a difference?
Well, I do think it is a problem that is bipartisan, completely. Like so I'm a center right person. My publisher was a conservative imprint, but I could find no difference between the parties really. They're pretty much equally corrupt in this sense. I think it's a problem of human nature that there is a tendency for people to want to use the resources and leverage they have to enrich themselves and their families. Um, but I do believe that incentives matter. And I do believe that it is possible to institute reforms that will disincentivize this behavior. Um, and I think that it's like an arms race, because as technology changes and as the world changes, the incentives change. And so I think it's time that we take another look at how to tamp down on corruption. And like, let me give you like one example of what I'm talking about. So it used to be the case that politicians could get paid to give speeches. And then it turned out that people who wanted to basically launder money to politicians would pay them to give a speech. And that was just an excuse to give the politician money. And so now it's illegal for members of Congress to get paid to give speeches. They're still allowed to give speeches, obviously, and not just on the floor of Congress, but you could go give a speech at a conference or whatever. You can't get paid for it. I would like to apply that same rule to writing books, because writing books in the last couple of decades has become the new way that politicians are cashing in and getting rich. And this is not sexy. I call this like the banality of corruption. People don't get outraged by politicians writing books, but the truth is, like, that's how Bernie Sanders became a millionaire. That's how Ron DeSantis became a millionaire. They wrote books, and the reason they were able to sell the book is because they were prominent politicians running for president. They sell the book. And that's not even the worst part, though. The worst part are the bulk sales. So sometimes you'll have like groups like the National Republican Campaign Committee or the DCCC they'll bulk purchase like 50,000 copies of someone's book, which can drive it to number one on the bestseller list. Which
So wait, you're saying it's not because these guys are really great authors? That's not it?
Most of them are not that good. There are some good politicians who write worthwhile books, but most political books are not, page turners. And yet somehow they sell all of these copies, and some of that money makes its way back into the pockets of the politician.
So it's not it's against the law to it is against the law to be paid to give a speech by somebody, because that's just basically laundering money. It's not against the law though to have a fundraiser in a really nice resort town, right?
That's the other side of it. So I have a chapter called The Lifestyle. And, certain people, like when they get divorced, there was like once upon a time a standard of alimony that was so someone could live a life to which they'd become accustomed. And I think one of the reasons politicians don't want to quit being politicians or lobbyists is because the life to which they've become accustomed. And so members of Congress have all sorts of opportunities to live an amazing lifestyle. Even if they're not rich themselves, they can live like a super rich person. And it could be a political fundraiser paid for by their campaign. that takes them, wherever you want to go. We're talking about posh, great, awesome resorts. Play tennis with the congressman, play golf with the congressman. Let's go, whatever it is. There are these international junkets and cultural tours that they can do as well. And so if you want to you want to see Bruce Springsteen, that could be a fundraiser paid for by the campaign. You want to go to Turkey, that could be a trip. Maybe you stay at the Four Seasons. Who knows? This is a pretty good lifestyle.
And the families get to participate in all that too, right?
Yes. Yes, usually, quite often that is the case.
Yeah. So you're always going to have,
and by the way, I would say sorry to interrupt, but it may be an occasion where, like I'm taking a private flight to Palm Beach, and my spouse has to pay some small percent of that flight, what would be considered fair value. But then, of course, we're staying in the same. She stays in my hotel room, which is covered by the campaign. So, in some cases, there are nominal fees that family members pay to get these lavish vacations.
Mm-hmm. One solution to these problems is sort of counterintuitive initially, which is to pay politicians more. Because if you think about it, like we said, if the salary for a congressman is $174,000 a year, that's a lot compared to the median household in the United States. But again, it's not like they're making $1 million. If you just paid them more to actually do their job, and they might be less susceptible to some of these other money-making schemes off on the side that really aren't related to their job. This has been tried in other places. For example, the highest paid head of state in the world is the president of Singapore, not because Singapore is a world power, but because they had huge bribery and corruption problems. So they just said, we're going to pay you guys a bunch of money so that you don't take bribes. And that seems to have worked a little bit there. Would a reform like that be something you'd be open to in the U.S.?
Absolutely. I don't know what that number is because I do think there's a point at which it would be too high. But I would raise the salary for members of Congress because Washington D.C. is incredibly expensive, and a lot of these politicians, sometimes they want their family to be with them. I can perfectly understand that. But they're probably having residences in some cases back home and in the DC area. That's very expensive. We want the best and brightest to be attracted. We don't want people to come here, get the experience so they can go make more money, right? So, and we don't want there to be brain drain. But then on the other hand, I don't want them to come here and try to stay forever and get rich as politicians. So I think there's a trade-off. But generally speaking, I would raise their salary in exchange for banning stock trading, banning the ability to pay family members, limiting the amount of money they can make off of book sales, things like that. So I think that in exchange for those reforms, we could pay them more money to focus on their actual job, which is, looking out for we the people.
And how much of it is a problem, too, of politicians not being able to focus on their job because they have to go out and fundraise and they have to go out and constantly be doing that. And then they're not really looking at legislation, the famous line from Nancy Pelosi, we have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. And, this seems to be, that's just across the board now that very few politicians actually are in the details of that because they're constantly, their schedules are very busy. There's only so many hours in the day. And all these different advocacy groups and the party needs them to go out to all these different fundraisers and shake all the right hands and all that.
It's a real problem. I guess this is one area where my book is different. A lot of people who've written books like this tend to be, and by the way, there's not a lot of people who've written books like this. Peter Schweitzer, I think, is the last person who wrote a book like this, and he's a conservative. But I think that there are a lot of people on the left who are very concerned about money in politics. And one of the things they want to do is like have public financing of campaigns. And that's a big difference between me and them. I'm not advocating for that. I do not think that's a good idea or an American. I don't think it's consistent with certainly not my political philosophy. So I think that maybe uncapping the House would help with this. But this book does not really address the problem of politicians having to raise a lot of money, and partly because number one, I don't think it's feasible or likely that anytime soon we are going to do campaign finance reform that would actually solve any problems like that. And number two, I'm not sure I would even want to because of kind of the free speech concerns that I have about it. So you're going to have to probably go somewhere else for concerns about the fact that politicians really do need to spend at least half their time raising money in order to be elected.
Yeah, you mentioned Peter Schweitzer. You mentioned him in the book as well, and parts of this book did feel like a throwback to kind of the Tea Party, early kind of Tea Party era, where you had this much stronger sense of people, I think, especially on the right, but also just in the country at large, of being, grossed out by politicians, not by Democrats and not by Republicans, but by politicians in general. That there was this idea that, that there was too much power in Washington, D.C., that it's a problem that, a lot of the wealthiest counties in the country border Washington, D.C., that it's a problem that so many people move to Washington, D.C., become rich there, making nothing. There's no industry. We don't see any export statistics from Washington, D.C. There's nothing that's actually being made that's a productive a productive economic activity. This is all money that's being made from lobbying, from exchanging favors for power and things like that. And so that sense seems to have weirdly declined, even though we're in this, we always talk about this populist moment where people are very anti-elite and all of that, but it doesn't seem as strong to me. And when you mentioned Schweitzer in your book, that was just kind of a reminder to me, like, oh yeah, like that used to be a thing that people talked about a lot more, I feel like.
I think it's I disagree a little. I think that it is palpable, but I think that it is that people are seeing it only through the prism of their own partisan blinders. And so people will rail about Ilhan Omar paying her husband money and Hunter Biden and taking, these 20 shell corporations, foreign money going to the Biden family. But they're not at all concerned about Jared Kushner taking $2 billion from a Saudi fund into his private equity firm, right? And then conversely, Republican or Democrats will have their version. Both sides. In fact, I saw it as I was doing the book tour for Filthy Rich Politicians. And the cool thing is, I went on like Michael Malice's podcast, who is like an anarcho-capitalist, and I went on the Young Turks show from the left, and I was on Megyn Kelly's show, and I did just a broad, and then Morning Joe and Jake Tapper and just a ton of different media, and everybody was interested in this topic. Everybody thought it was important, but when I would go on a left-leaning show, they would always talk about, Jared Kushner and Richard Burr, and when I would go, on a right-leaning show, it was all about Hunter Biden, and AOC and Nancy Pelosi, and so I think people are still concerned about it, but they're very selective concern.
Mm-hmm. What does it take, you think, to get people to be concerned about it all the time?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I will say, just to kind of reiterate something I said at the top, in terms of my motives, because I am someone who is coming from, I say, the center right, but I am a conservative who wants to conserve liberal democracy and our institutions. I believe that the system we have in this country we have is a miracle. And in order to preserve this great thing, we have to make sure that our elected officials earn our trust, and that people buy into the system, and that if people believe the game is rigged, then that the whole thing could come down. So that's kind of my agenda as a center right person. I am more than willing to see this problem on both sides, but I just think polarization right now in America is so bad that it would be hard to probably get partisans on either side to address or admit any problems from their own tribe.
It seems to me like part of the solution's got to be making government smaller, right? I mean, just making this less powerful so that it's not so desirable to be in these positions. To, if you don't have anything to lobby about, it doesn't really make you that excited to be a lobbyist, right? And it certainly won't be that high paying. And so, what do you think the argument for smaller government has to do with it?
Well, I think that's true, but I don't see government getting any smaller anytime soon. I don't think it's likely that we could do that. And so I think reforms like uncapping the House and having more members of Congress are much more likely to be workable and effective at solving these problems. And so, yes, technically speaking, I completely agree with you. But certainly in the short term, I think that some of the reforms that we've discussed today are more likely to be implemented and impact this problem.
Sure. Yeah. One of the examples you talk about in the book, I remember this because it was right after I had moved to the Washington D.C. area for college, and because it's all the same media market, you get campaign ads from Maryland. One of these was for David Trone, the congressman from Maryland, who his advertisements were everywhere. It was unbelievable. I mean, every single commercial break, it was just constant. He was like you would think he was the only politician running for anything in the whole area. It was unbelievable. And then I looked more into this, and he had already tried previously to run for Congress, and he spent $12 million of his own money and lost in the primary. Now that was just embarrassing. But rather than be embarrassed about it, he did it again. And the second time it actually worked, and he was able to get elected. And I just thought, I cannot imagine, if you're already wealthy, he runs a chain of wine stores, right? What a fun job that must be. I mean, like, why? He's made tons of money doing that. Why in the world would you want to be in Congress that badly that you'd put yourself through that for 2 election cycles, spending millions of your own money in order to be one of 435 members of a chamber? It just blows my mind. And I hope someday we can at least get to a point, in our political culture where people don't want power that badly.
Yeah.
People actually are able to people are able to be to just be happy with what they're actually good at, and not be out there feeling the need to use all that money in order to run for office. But this has been a great conversation, Matt, and you should definitely check out the book, Filthy Rich Politicians. Tons of stories, tons of specific anecdotes in there about different politicians on both sides of the aisle doing all sorts of things. We heard about some of them on this conversation today, but there's plenty more in the book, and it'll really open up your eyes to some of the things that are going on in DC. And Matt does a great job of bringing it in a really easy to read way, and it's not too long of a book. You'll be able to get through it in a good amount of time. So check it out, filthy rich politicians. And thank you for being with us, Matt.
Thank you.